She was called Barren by the very family that once celebrated her wedding, thrown away like something broken beyond repair, and sent back to a life she thought she'd escaped. He was a mafia boss raising 3 motherless infants alone, cold enough to freeze a boardroom, terrified enough of failure to never let anyone close. Then one rainy night, she knocked on the wrong door looking for shelter, and everything he built to protect his heart began to crumble. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, if you've ever been discarded by people who should have loved you louder, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, because what happens between Zora and Baek Do-hyun will remind you that sometimes the family you were denied is exactly the family waiting to find you. Comment the word healing right now if you believe broken people can build something whole together. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss where this journey goes, and let's begin. Zora Adeyemi stood outside a modest brick house in the hills above Seoul with rain soaking through her coat and a suitcase that held everything she owned in the world. 3 months ago she had been Mrs. Danladi, wife of a wealthy hotel developer in Lagos, celebrated at parties, photographed in magazines. 2 months ago the doctors confirmed what her mother-in-law had been whispering for years. Zora could not carry a child. 1 month ago her husband signed divorce papers without looking her in the eye, and his mother had called her a curse wrapped in a beautiful body. Zora had come to Korea because her college roommate lived here, because it was far enough away that no one would recognize her face, because starting over required distance. But the address her roommate had given her led to darkness, an empty apartment, a note taped to the door explaining a sudden move to Busan. Zora stood in the rain with nowhere to go and a phone with 12% battery, and she did the only thing that made sense. She knocked on the nearest lit window. The door that opened was not the door of a stranger looking for company. It belonged to Baek Do-hyun, a man whose name made grown men reroute their entire schedules, whose organization controlled shipping lanes and territory disputes that never made the news but shaped the underground economy of 3 cities. He answered the door in shirt sleeves, exhausted, because somewhere behind him 3 7-month-old triplets were screaming in 3 different registers of distress, and the 4th nanny in 5 weeks had just quit through a text message that simply said "I can't." He looked at the drenched woman standing on his porch, and his first instinct, trained by 15 years of danger, was suspicion. His second instinct, the one he didn't understand yet, was something closer to relief. "I'm sorry," Zora said, her voice shaking from cold. "I think I have the wrong address. I just need to call a taxi. My phone is dying." Behind him, the crying intensified. A baby's wail cracked into a higher pitch that sounded like real pain rather than mere frustration. Do-hyun's jaw tightened, torn between the stranger at his door and the chaos behind him. "Do you know anything about babies?" he asked instead of answering her question at all. Zora blinked, rain dripping from her lashes. "I was training to be a pediatric nurse before I got married." "Why?" He stepped back from the door, an invitation that surprised him even as he extended it. "Then come inside. I will pay you for 1 hour. After that, I will call you a car myself." She should have said no. Every rational part of her, the part that had learned caution the hard way, told her not to walk into a stranger's house in a foreign country at night. But the crying inside sounded desperate, and desperation was something Zora understood intimately, and so she stepped over the threshold, dripping onto imported marble, and followed the sound of suffering into a nursery that looked like a battlefield. 3 cribs, 3 babies, 1 exhausted man who clearly had not slept in what looked like days. Zora set down her suitcase without thinking and moved to the crib on the left where the smallest of the triplets was arching her back in obvious discomfort. She lifted the baby, checked her diaper, felt her forehead, and within 30 seconds diagnosed what 5 professional nannies had apparently missed. "She has gas trapped," Zora said calmly, already positioning the infant against her forearm in a technique she'd learned years ago. "Do you have gripe water or simethicone drops?" Do-hyun stared at her like she had performed a miracle. "In the cabinet. Blue bottle." 15 minutes later, all 3 triplets were asleep, actually asleep, breathing evenly in their cribs for the first time in 2 days according to the dark circles under Do-hyun's eyes. Zora stood in the doorway of the nursery, suddenly aware of how strange the last hour had been, how she was standing in the home of a stranger with wet hair and an empty phone battery. "I should call that taxi now," she said quietly. Do-hyun looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind his tired eyes. "Stay the night." The guest room is made up. Tomorrow we can discuss compensation for tonight, and perhaps, he paused like the words cost him something, perhaps a more permanent arrangement if you are interested in work. Zora should have refused. Instead, exhaustion and homelessness and the surprising warmth of holding a sleeping child again after months of being told her body was a failure made her nod. That single nod would change the direction of both their lives forever. The next morning, Zora woke in an unfamiliar bed in a house that smelled like cedar and coffee, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered the crying babies, the tired stranger, the desperate hour of diagnosing gas pain and rocking infants back to sleep. She found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee and discovered Baek Do-hyun standing at the counter in a black shirt that made him look less like a mafia boss and more like a man who simply hadn't slept properly in months. His eyes were sharp despite the exhaustion, cataloguing her the way she imagined he catalogued everything, threats and assets and unknowns. "You're still here," he said, not quite a question. "Your guest room has better locks than my last apartment," Zora replied, and immediately wondered why she'd said something so casually honest to a man she knew nothing about. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough that Zora noticed. He gestured to a stool at the counter and slid a cup of coffee toward her without asking how she took it, though he'd apparently guessed correctly, black with just a little sugar. "My name is Baek Do-hyun," he said. "I run several businesses in Seoul. My wife died 8 months ago during childbirth. The triplets survived. I have not." The bluntness of it startled her. Zora set down the coffee cup. "I'm so sorry. I'm not asking for sympathy. I am explaining the situation because you handled last night better than 5 professional nannies combined, and I need someone who can actually manage 3 infants without quitting by text message." He studied her. "What is your name?" "Zora Adeyemi." "Zora." He said it like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. "You said you trained as a pediatric nurse." "Before I got married. I stopped when my husband's family decided a working wife was an embarrassment." The words came out bitter before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted the honesty. Do-hyun's expression didn't change, but something in his posture sharpened, the way a predator sharpens at the scent of prey, except Zora realized later it wasn't predatory at all. It was protective, an instinct activating toward an injustice he recognized instantly because injustice was a language he spoke fluently in his own world. "Your husband was a fool," he said simply, and then, before she could respond, "I would like to offer you a position. Live-in caretaker for my children. The pay will be generous. The hours will be demanding. I travel frequently for business and I need someone the triplets can depend on completely." Zora's mind raced through the practical calculations of a woman with no home, no family support, and a suitcase containing everything she owned. She should negotiate. She should ask questions about the business he ran, about the danger implied by the security cameras she'd noticed lining the hallway, about the 2 men in dark suits she'd glimpsed through the kitchen window standing guard at the gate. "I'll need to know what kind of businesses you run," she said instead, because some caution remained even in desperation. Do-hyun's gaze held hers, steady and unblinking. "The kind that would put you in danger simply by association if you accept this position. I will not lie to you about that. I run an organization that operates largely outside legal boundaries. I have enemies. Those enemies would see you and my children as leverage if given the opportunity." He watched her face for the flicker of fear he expected, the recoil, the immediate refusal. Instead, Zora considered his words with the same steady calculation she'd have applied to any medical assessment. "And if I take this job, what protections would I have?" "Everything I have," Do-hyun said, and something in his voice made the promise feel less like corporate language and more like a vow. "No one touches what belongs to my household. That includes staff." Zora thought of Lagos, of a mother-in-law's cruel words, of a husband who had let his family discard her without a single word of defense. She thought of the 3 sleeping babies upstairs who had finally slept peacefully because of her hands. "I accept," she said. "On one condition. When we're alone, you tell me the truth. About the children, about the danger, about anything that affects my safety. I don't do lies well. I've had enough of them." Do-hyun extended his hand across the counter, an oddly formal gesture given everything that had just been discussed. Agreed. Their hands met, and Zora felt something electric pass between their palms, something neither of them acknowledged out loud, though both of them noticed it. Over the following weeks, Zora settled into the rhythm of the house on the hill. The triplets, whose names she learned were Ariam, Hannah, and little June, began to respond to her the way infants respond to consistency and warmth, with trust that built daily. She learned their individual cries, learned that Ariam needed to be held facing outward to calm down, that Hannah preferred lullabies sung rather than hummed, that June, the smallest, needed skin contact more than the others because he'd spent the longest in the incubator after their mother's death. Do-hyun watched all of this from the periphery of his own house at first, a man observing something foreign and precious happening in the rooms he had avoided since his wife's death. He began coming home earlier. He began appearing in doorways during feeding time, watching Zora navigate 3 hungry infants with a calm efficiency that seemed impossible. "You're staring again," Zora said one evening without looking up from where she was burping Hannah against her shoulder. "I am observing," Do-hyun corrected, though the corner of his mouth twitched again, that almost smile she was starting to recognize as significant, given how his security team had informed her, in careful whispered warnings during her first week, that their boss hadn't smiled since before the accident that killed his wife. "Observing what, exactly?" "How you make chaos look manageable." He stepped fully into the nursery, uncharacteristically, since he usually kept a careful distance from the rooms that reminded him most acutely of his failures as a father. "My wife wanted 3 children. She got her wish. And paid for it with her life. I have spent 8 months terrified that I would fail them the way I failed her." Zora set Hannah down gently in her crib before turning to face him fully. "You didn't fail her. Childbirth complications aren't a failure of love." "I wasn't there," Do-hyun said, and the admission seemed to cost him something enormous. "I was in a meeting securing a shipping contract when she went into early labor. By the time I arrived at the hospital, she was already." Do-hyun stopped himself, his jaw working. "I have not forgiven myself for that absence." The vulnerability in his voice, so different from the controlled mafia boss persona he wore like armor during business hours, made something shift in Zora's chest. She recognized pain when she saw it, having spent months drowning in her own. "Guilt doesn't bring people back," she said softly. "But it can poison the people who are still here if you let it. Your children need you present, not perfect." Do-hyun looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "You speak like someone who understands grief intimately." "My marriage ended because I couldn't have children," Zora said, the words easier to share now than they'd been in Lagos, where every conversation about her infertility had been weaponized. "My husband's family called me barren like it was a curse word. Like my body's failure erased every other thing I was. So yes, I understand what it feels like when the people who should protect you decide instead to discard you." Something dangerous flickered behind Do-hyun's eyes, and Zora watched his hands curl briefly into fists before deliberately relaxing. "They were fools," he said, echoing his earlier words with more heat this time. "Any family who would discard someone capable of what you've done for my children in 3 weeks does not deserve to keep her." The compliment landed somewhere unexpected in Zora's chest, warm and unfamiliar. She busied herself with June's blanket to hide the flush rising in her cheeks. "You barely know me, Mr. Baek." "Do-hyun," he corrected. "And I know enough." A few days later, Do-hyun's grandmother arrived unannounced, a formidable woman named Madame Baek who had run the family's legitimate business interests for 30 years and who apparently possessed the kind of sharp intuition that made her grandson's underground empire nervous. She found Zora in the garden feeding the triplets and studied the scene with narrowed, assessing eyes. "You're the new nanny," Madame Baek said, not quite a question. "Zora Adeyemi, African. Interesting." Madame Baek settled onto a garden bench with the assistance of a cane she clearly used more for authority than actual need. "My grandson has gone through 5 nannies in as many weeks. Tell me why you have lasted 3. Zora considered the question carefully while adjusting June's grip on his bottle. "Because I don't see them as a job to survive. I see them as children who lost their mother and need someone who won't leave." Madame Baek's sharp eyes studied her for a long moment. And what about my grandson? Do you see him as a job to survive as well? The question hung in the air with an implication Zora wasn't prepared to address directly. Mr. Beck has been kind to me. Professional. That is all. Madam Beck's tone suggested she believed exactly none of that. He has not smiled since his wife's funeral. Did you know that? Not once. My grandson has built walls so high around his heart that I feared he would never let anyone close again, not even his own children. She paused meaningfully. Yesterday, Secretary Han informed me that Do-hyun laughed. Actually laughed, watching you attempt to teach little June to clap. I have not heard that sound from him in 8 months. Zora's throat tightened unexpectedly. I didn't realize. No, Madam Beck said, standing with the aid of her cane. I suspect you didn't. But I did, and I'm telling you now so that you understand what is happening in this house, whether either of you is ready to acknowledge it. She moved toward the door, then paused. Be careful with him, child. He has been broken in ways that take a very long time to heal. But do not run from what you might build here simply because it frightens you. The people who love us rarely arrive at convenient moments. That evening, Zora found herself replaying Madam Beck's words while rocking little Ariam to sleep, watching the moonlight spill across the nursery floor. Downstairs, she could hear Do-hyun's voice, low and measured, speaking to someone on the phone in the clipped tones he used for business, and she wondered, not for the first time, exactly what world she had stepped into and whether she was already too deep to climb back out safely. If you're invested in Zora and Do-hyun's story already, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and hit that subscribe button, because what happens over the next few weeks is going to test everything both of them have built. 2 months into her employment, Zora had become as essential to the household rhythm as the sunrise. The triplets thrived under her care, gaining weight steadily, sleeping through the night for the first time since birth, developing the kind of secure attachment that pediatric literature promised but that Zora had witnessed firsthand transform 3 traumatized infants into 3 genuinely happy babies. Do-hyun noticed everything. He noticed the way Ariam reached for Zora before anyone else. He noticed how Hannah had started babbling what sounded suspiciously like an attempt at her name. He noticed, with a possessive tightness in his chest he refused to examine too closely, how the house felt like a home again instead of a monument to grief. He also noticed, with growing alarm, how often his thoughts drifted to Zora during business meetings, how he found himself rushing through negotiations to get home earlier, how the sound of her laughter carrying up from the garden made something in his chest unclench that had been wound tight since his wife's death. The complication arrived in the form of Choi Yun-woo, a business associate's son who had been invited to a dinner Do-hyun was forced to host for a shipping negotiation. Yun-woo was young, handsome in an obvious way, and utterly charmed the moment Zora entered the room to check on the triplets during the gathering. You must be the nanny everyone is talking about, Yun-woo said smoothly, rising from his seat to intercept her path. I've heard remarkable things. Perhaps you join us for a drink once the children are settled. Zora, unused to such direct attention after months of feeling invisible in her own marriage, offered a polite but distant smile. That's kind, but I have responsibilities tonight. Surely someone else could watch them for an hour. No, Do-hyun's voice cut across the room before Zora could respond, colder than she'd heard it in weeks. Miss Adeyemi's responsibilities are not negotiable for the convenience of dinner guests. The room went quiet. Yun-woo's father shot his son a warning look. Zora, caught between 2 men whose tension she didn't fully understand, excused herself quickly and retreated upstairs, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Do-hyun found Zora in the kitchen preparing bottles for the morning. His jaw was still tight with residual irritation. You didn't have to intervene like that, Zora said without looking up. I could have handled Mr. Choi's invitation myself. He was inappropriate. Do-hyun's voice had an edge to it that Zora was beginning to recognize as jealousy, though she wasn't ready to name it that directly. Flirting with staff during a business dinner reflects poorly on discipline and respect. Is that what I am to you? Staff whose reputation needs protecting? The question landed harder than she intended, and Do-hyun's expression shifted, something raw breaking through his careful composure. You know that's not entirely true. Do I? Zora set down the bottle she was holding, turning to face him fully. Because sometimes I can't tell if you're protecting your children's caretaker or something else entirely, Do-hyun. And I need to know which, because I've already survived one man who couldn't decide what I meant to him until it was too late to matter. The silence between them stretched, charged with everything neither of them had said aloud in the 2 months since she'd walked through his door in the rain. Do-hyun crossed the kitchen slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. I have not felt anything beyond grief and duty in 8 months, he said quietly. Since you arrived, I find myself distracted by the sound of your voice through the walls. I find myself rushing through meetings that used to consume me entirely. I find myself wanting to be the reason you smile instead of simply watching you make my children smile. He paused, something vulnerable crossing his face. I do not know what that means, Zora, except that it terrifies me and I cannot seem to stop it. Zora's breath caught. Do-hyun. I know my world is dangerous. I know what I am asking, simply by admitting this, puts you at greater risk than you already carry by living in my home. I know you have been hurt by people who should have protected you, and I have no right to ask for your trust when I cannot even guarantee your safety completely. His hand came up, hesitant, hovering near her cheek without quite touching. But I find that I want to try anyway, if you would let me. The vulnerability in his eyes, so different from the cold mafia boss the world feared, undid something protective in Zora's chest that she'd built brick by brick since her divorce. She leaned into his hand, finally letting his palm cup her cheek. I'm scared too, she admitted softly. I'm scared of being discarded again. I'm scared that whatever this is will end the moment you realize I can't give you what your wife could have given you eventually, if she'd survived. Children of my own. A family that looks the way families are supposed to look. Do-hyun's expression turned fierce, something protective and absolute crossing his face. You already gave my children a mother, Zora. In every way that matters, you have already done what my wife's death made me believe was impossible. Whatever your body can or cannot do biologically changes nothing about what you have already built in this house. The words, so different from the cruelty she'd absorbed in Lagos, broke something open in Zora's chest. Tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over, and Do-hyun pulled her against his chest without hesitation, holding her the way he'd wanted to for weeks but hadn't allowed himself to admit. I'm not asking you to replace her, Zora whispered against his shirt. I would never try to replace what you had with your wife. I know, Do-hyun murmured into her hair. I'm not asking you to. I am asking you to build something new, alongside the grief, not instead of it. Something that is entirely ours. They stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding each other in the quiet aftermath of confession, and when Do-hyun finally pulled back enough to look at her face, the question in his eyes was clear even before he spoke it. Can I kiss you? Zora's answer was to close the remaining distance herself, and when their lips met, it felt less like a beginning and more like something both of them had been circling for months without naming. By the end of that week, the household had settled into a new rhythm, one where Do-hyun no longer hid his affection behind professional distance, where Zora found herself humming while she worked instead of simply surviving each day. The triplets, perceptive in the way infants somehow always are, seemed to sense the shift, growing calmer whenever both adults were in the room together. But danger, as it always does in worlds like Do-hyun's, arrived without warning. 3 weeks after their kiss in the kitchen, Do-hyun received a call that changed his careful expression into something Zora had never seen before, a controlled fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. What happened? She asked once he'd hung up. A rival organization, Do-hyun said, his voice tight. Led by a man named Gang-hyun. He has been probing my territory for months, testing boundaries. My security chief just informed me that surveillance was discovered outside this house. Someone has been watching. Zora's blood ran cold. Watching the children. Watching everyone in this household. Do-hyun's jaw tightened further. Including you. The next few days passed in a blur of increased security, armed guards stationed at every entrance, cameras installed in rooms that had never needed them before. Zora tried to maintain normalcy for the triplets' sake, but the tension in the house was palpable, a held breath waiting to be released. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Zora took the triplets for what should have been a routine walk in the private garden, only for one of Do-hyun's security team to intercept her at a dead run, weapon drawn, shouting for her to get back inside immediately. Through the hedges, Zora glimpsed unfamiliar men scaling the garden wall, and her maternal instinct, fierce and immediate despite these not being biologically her children, took over completely. She grabbed the double stroller and ran for the house, adrenaline drowning out the fear that would hit her later. Do-hyun arrived home to chaos, security swarming the property, his children screaming from the fright of the commotion, and Zora white-faced but steady, having gotten all 3 triplets to safety inside a reinforced panic room before the intruders could breach the perimeter properly. He found her there, still trembling slightly from adrenaline, holding June against her chest while Aryam and Hannah clung to her legs. "They're safe," Zora said before he could ask, her voice steadier than she felt. "I got them inside before anyone reached the house." Do-hyun crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her and the children into his arms, holding all 4 of them like he could shield them through sheer will alone. "I almost lost you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "All of you." "But you didn't," Zora said firmly. "We're here. We're safe. This cannot happen again." Do-hyun pulled back enough to look at her directly, his expression hardening into the calculated fury of a man who had just discovered exactly how much he had to lose. "Gang-hyun has made a mistake targeting my family. I will end this before it goes any further." Over the following days, Do-hyun mobilized his entire organization, calling in favors, gathering intelligence, tracing the surveillance back to its source. Zora watched him transform from the gentle father she'd fallen for into the ruthless boss whose reputation had built an empire, and she understood, watching him work, exactly why his enemies feared him. But the investigation revealed something more disturbing than a simple territorial dispute. Gang-hyun had been in contact with someone inside Do-hyun's own household, feeding information about the family's schedule, their vulnerabilities, specifically targeting the triplets as the perfect leverage against a man who had rebuilt his entire life around protecting them. "Someone betrayed us," Do-hyun said grimly, showing Zora the evidence his security team had uncovered. "One of the household staff has been selling information for months." The investigation eventually pointed to Roy, the estate's longtime groundskeeper, a man who had worked for the family since before Do-hyun's marriage and whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable to Gang-hyun's bribery. When confronted, Roy confessed everything, weeping with shame, explaining how the debts had spiraled beyond his control and how Gang-hyun's men had threatened his own family if he refused to cooperate. Do-hyun's fury was terrifying to witness, cold and absolute, but Zora watched something complicated cross his face as Roy sobbed his confession, a flicker of understanding buried beneath the anger. "You endangered my children," Do-hyun said, his voice deadly quiet. "I know," Roy whispered. "I know, and I am sorry. They threatened my daughter, sir. I didn't know what else to do." Zora, watching from the doorway, saw the exact moment Do-hyun's rage cooled into something more calculated. He was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You will tell me everything you know about Gang-hyun's operation," Do-hyun said finally. "Every detail, every contact, every plan. In exchange, I will ensure your daughter's safety, and I will not kill you, though you deserve it. But you will never work for me again, and if you ever come near this family after today, the mercy I am showing you now will not repeat itself." Roy's confession, combined with Do-hyun's own intelligence network, revealed Gang-hyun's plan in full. A coordinated attempt to kidnap the triplets during a planned outing to secure leverage over Do-hyun's entire operation, forcing him to cede valuable territory or lose his children permanently. "We move up the timeline," Do-hyun told his security chief that night. "Gang-hyun believes he has weeks to plan. He has days." The confrontation, when it came, unfolded not in some abandoned warehouse but in the very territory Gang-hyun had been trying to claim, a strategic masterstroke that Do-hyun orchestrated with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years building an empire on careful calculation. Zora, kept safely at a secured location with the triplets during the operation, spent the longest hours of her life waiting for news, praying to a god she'd stopped fully trusting since her divorce that the man she'd fallen for would come home safely. When Do-hyun finally arrived at the secure location, exhausted but unharmed, Zora ran to him without hesitation, checking every inch of him for injury before he finally caught her hands and stilled her frantic searching. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It's over. Gang Yoon's organization has been dismantled. He fled the country rather than face what remained of his operation." "You're sure?" Zora's voice trembled with relief and lingering fear. "I'm sure." Do-hyun pulled her against his chest, breathing her in like she was the only solid thing in a world that had nearly shattered. "We're safe. All of us." That night, after the triplets had finally settled into peaceful sleep, unaware of how close danger had come to their small lives, Zora found Do-hyun standing on the balcony overlooking the garden where intruders had once climbed the walls, now patrolled by a security team that would never again allow such a breach. "I need to ask you something," Do-hyun said without turning around. "Anything." He turned to face her, something vulnerable and determined in his expression. "These past months have taught me something I thought I had lost forever after my wife died. The capacity to want a future instead of simply surviving the present." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Zora's breath catch entirely. "I am not asking you to replace anyone, Zora. I am asking you to build something new with me, something that is entirely ours, something that includes 3 children who already call you the name I hope you'll let them make official." Zora's tears came before she could stop them, but this time they were tears of something she'd thought impossible after Lagos, after the divorce, after being told her body's failure made her unworthy of love. "Yes," she whispered before he'd even finished opening the box. "Yes. Do-hyun. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, an unfamiliar vulnerability in a man the underground world feared, and when he kissed her, it felt like every broken piece of both their pasts finally settling into something whole. They married 3 months later in a small ceremony attended only by family and the closest members of Do-hyun's trusted circle. Madame Baek cried through the entire ceremony, though she'd deny it fiercely if anyone mentioned it later. The triplets, now walking on unsteady legs, toddled through the reception in matching outfits, delighting every guest with their attempts at dancing. If this story has moved you even a little, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment so far, and make sure you've hit subscribe, because the most beautiful part of Zora and Do-hyun's story is still ahead. A year into their marriage, Zora had settled fully into her role, not as a nanny anymore but as the triplets' mother in every sense that mattered, and as Do-hyun's wife in ways that had healed wounds neither of them had expected to survive. The house that once echoed with grief now filled with laughter, with the sound of 3 toddlers learning to speak in a mixture of Korean and the Yoruba phrases Zora taught them from her own childhood, weaving her heritage into the fabric of their family. But one afternoon, Zora sat in the bathroom of their home, staring at a test she hadn't dared to take in over a year, having accepted the diagnosis Lagos doctors had given her as an unchangeable fact of her body. The 2 lines that appeared felt impossible, felt like a cruel joke, felt like something she couldn't quite believe until 3 separate confirmations from her Korean physician made the reality undeniable. She was pregnant. The body that had been called barren, that had been discarded by a family who valued fertility over love, was carrying a child that medical science had once told her was impossible. When she told Do-hyun, showing him the ultrasound with hands that shook with disbelief, his reaction was not the calculated calm of a mafia boss but the raw, unguarded joy of a man who had thought this particular miracle had been permanently foreclosed to him. "How?" he whispered, staring at the small image like it contained the secret of the universe. "I don't know," Zora said, laughing through sudden tears. "The doctors say sometimes diagnoses aren't as absolute as they seem, especially when the original diagnosis came from stress and grief rather than a full medical workup. Maybe Lagos got it wrong. Maybe I healed somewhere along the way, healed enough to make room for this. I don't know, Do-hyun. I just know it's real." He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in his world, which by then, she absolutely was. "You already gave me everything, Zora. You healed 3 children who lost their mother before they ever knew her. You healed me, when I thought grief had closed every door in my heart permanently. This," he touched her stomach gently, reverently, "this is simply proof that love finds a way to multiply itself, even when the world insists it shouldn't be possible." Their daughter arrived 7 months later, healthy and screaming with the same fierce energy that had characterized her 3 older siblings' arrival into the world. They named her Adeze, a name Zora's grandmother had carried, meaning princess in her native tongue, a fitting name for a child born from a love story that had defied every cruel prediction made against her mother's body. Watching Do-hyun hold his 4th child, tears he made no effort to hide streaming down his face while the triplets crowded around the hospital bed trying to get a glimpse of their new sister, Zora thought of Lagos, of the mother-in-law who had called her Barren, of the husband who had signed her away without a fight. She thought of how far she had traveled, not just in distance but in the journey from discarded to essential, from broken to whole. "Thank you," Do-hyun murmured against her temple as the whole family gathered around their newest member. "Thank you for walking through my door that night. Thank you for choosing to stay when you had every reason to run." "Thank you for seeing me," Zora replied, "when the rest of the world only saw what I couldn't give them." Years later, when people would ask Baek Do-hyun how a man renowned for cold calculation had built the warmest household in Seoul's underground circles, he would simply smile, an expression that had become as natural to him as breathing since the night a stranger knocked on his door in the rain, and say that sometimes the family we need arrives exactly when we've stopped believing anyone could save us. Sometimes the people the world discards become the very ones who teach us what it means to be whole. If Zora and Do-hyun's story reminded you that being discarded by someone doesn't mean you are unworthy, that healing often comes wrapped in unexpected packages, drop that word in the comments one more time. Share this with someone who needs to believe love can rebuild what the world tried to break, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end.